Hello and welcome or welcome back. In this video I'm showing a process for making nice looking dichroic feather jewelry, pendants, brooches and hair clips like barrettes. And I'm using this bullseye thin reed black with a rainbow coloring so that I get gradual color shifts in my feathers. And here's a closer look at this glass. This bullseye with the suffix 051 is very thin glass and it has raised lines on it like this. So it's perfect for making my feathers. So I have to decide on the orientation of these lines because if they're not steep enough they'll wind up looking more like leaves than feathers. And here's what I'm talking about. The angle of those lines can produce an image that looks more like a leaf than a feather. And it's CBS dichro that I use, Coatings by Sandberg. In fact, I did a video on the best way to buy dichroic glass, and it's in the fused glass category, and it's number W-40, so that's worth checking out. So I'm going to draw on the dichro bag here with a felt pen to show how I'm going to cut this. So for the orientation of my lines, this angle here would produce something that looks more like a leaf, so I'm going to bring the angle up to something like about there, and that's perfect for my feathers. So I'm going to draw a line on there, like that, and this will be the right-handed side of the feather. So I'll cut these like this. And coming down the other side of my cut, I'll also get right-handed sides. And I'll draw another straight line about 1.25 inches away from my first one. And then I'll do this. I'll put the bottom of the feather in here, like that, to minimize the amount of waste. And I'll use the same angle on the other side to make my left-sided pieces. But I'm not going to cut into the full sheet quite yet. I'm going to use this same angle and I'm going to bring it over to the edge and make my first cut here. Just wide enough for 2 feathers. And of course I have to cut the back side because of the texture. And I'll mark this with little tabs of tape so I know exactly where to cut it when I flip it over. And I always cut on a piece of tight piled carpet with some sheets of newspaper on top and a piece of plastic to dump the chips. And now I'll cut a corresponding piece off the other end to match my angle. Okay, here's my design oriented on the left and the right. It's very important that these are parallel lines that are nice and straight so that when these are fused together there's no space between them. And right now, as you can hear, they're not parallel. There's a lump in there somewhere. And that's a problem with cutting textured glass. And there's my lump there. And that's an issue with cutting textured glass. So I've got to take this outside and rub it on some sandpaper to knock off those points. And I have a piece of belt sander belt that I use for that purpose. Okay, these are ready to be cut now. Incidentally, the area of the dichro sheet that I started at was the area that had the darkest color on the black glass, which means it has the least amount of coating. So these feathers from this particular region are going to have dark areas on them. So in the design of these feather pieces, first of all, I start out with an area that's flat at the bottom because I need to be able to fuse the quill onto it. And the quill will also have a hole in the middle for the ones that will be hung as pendants on a necklace. So I'll start with this, and then I'll start coming out with a larger area and then I'll gradually work it down to become thinner towards the tip of the feather. And on the other side, I don't make them identical. I don't make them a mirror copy. On the other side, I'll do a flat area, and then I'll come out as well, but I tend to put a bit of a dent in the side so that they don't actually have parallel lines on each side. I think it makes them look more realistic. So first I'll cut them in half. So I'll just leave a little bit of straight area for the quill line. And now I have to make a corresponding one on this side that's exactly the same length. That's why I'm doing them together. So I'm going to start from the thin area this time and work down towards the thicker area. And I gave it that little wobble in the edge there so it doesn't actually match the other one. I don't like a swivel cutter, so I always undo this screw, flip it around the other way, and do the screw up again so that it doesn't swivel. Swivels are great if you're making cuts along a straight edge, but if you're doing curves, I find it very frustrating to have a swivel head. Okay, I'll get a few more of these pairs cut up, and then we'll go on to the next stage. And now I'm working on my first strips that have two parallel sides, and here's the result. Here's two lefts with the waist in the middle, and here's two rights with the waist in the middle. For this last one here, I'm going to be making 4-inch barrettes. So here's the barrette clip here. I have to make sure that my feathers are longer than the clip. And they have to be wider at the tip to hide the width of the clip underneath. Ooh, that just hides the clip. Okay, I've got a bunch of sets made up here. So I'm going to draw out the pieces and how they get assembled before I go on with the next cutting step. And here's what my sheet looks like now that I've taken 3 strips off each side. Okay, so here's a drawing that shows the top view of one of the feathers and the corresponding edge view as it would be assembled on the kiln shelf. So if this bottom line here is the kiln shelf, what I've done is I've cut the 2mm feather which sits here on this layer. And above it I'm going to cut a piece of 3mm clear glass that extends a little bit beyond the outside dimensions of the dichroic pieces. And that's especially important over here because I have to join the quill underneath, and for the pendants that are going to have a hole in them for putting on a cord or a necklace chain, there needs to be a cap put on top here actually as well. So there needs to be a way of bridging this so it fuses together nicely, and a way of staggering this joint down here so it fuses together nicely. So here's a closer look at this detail. This piece here is my 2mm dichroic feather. This piece here will be a piece of 2mm black for a quill. And this is the 3mm clear cover cap and the 3mm clear cover cap on the quill with a little space in it for a hole, and then a piece of 2mm glass, most likely I'll be using black, to bridge the hole like this. And for the ones that don't have a hole, I'll still have to put a little piece on top to bridge these two pieces so they fuse together instead of separate in the fusing process. Okay, I'm going to go on with the clear pieces. So just using scraps of 3mm glass, I'm going to place it on top, And there's my extended edge here along the bottom side where the quill joins, like in the drawing. And I think I should just be able to go along with the glass cutter and cut these out without having to mark them first. I'm just going to cut them out a little bit bigger. All the way around. There, that might look a bit excessive having that much extra glass, but it's very important. There's enough material there to roll over the outside edge and cap that coating so it doesn't creep out and start moving along the outside. And here's all my feather pairs with the corresponding clear cover caps. So now I'm going to cut this piece here, the black 2mm quill, and the clear cover strips that go on top of the quill. And I've got 2mm black irid glass that I'll be using for this. So I'm making the strips less than 1/4 inch, more like about 3/16 of an inch. And now for the 3mm clear cover pieces. I'll cut them just slightly larger. And I'll cut these quills into pieces about 3/4 of an inch long. Now for the hole in the middle. If these feathers are going to be hung on a cord around a neck, the hole can't go from the front to the back. The hole has to go from one edge through to the other edge. And for that, I'm going to use the core method. The core method is a way of fusing the hole in its location instead of drilling it in afterwards. I covered that in a previous video, actually. Video W-101. I showed a variety of different bracelets and jewelry that had holes fused in position, and I'm going to use the same technique here. So I've got some very thin stainless wire here, like a very thin TIG welding rod, and that's what I'm going to use to make my cores. So I'm going to dip them in this super thick shelf primer, and that's the mold release so that I can get them out of my hole afterwards. So I've coated about 4 inches or so. I'm going to be cutting this wire up into sections to lay into my fusing, and some of it's going to chip off when I cut it. So I'm going to prepare several of these. And I have a block of wood with holes drilled in it as a rack to dry them in, and it's important to let them air dry naturally overnight. If they're heated, then the coating dries prematurely and it tends to crack. Now before I can assemble these on the kiln board for fusing, I have to elevate my core wires, because what happens during the firing is the metal inside the core is heavier than the glass and it will slowly sink down during the firing. So I need to elevate them. And that means that I need to arrange my glass pieces on the kiln board between a metal support system that can hold them in place. So if this is an edge view here, and this is my kiln board, and this is my quill, then the core is going to sit like this. So I need a support system that's the same thickness as my quill, which is 2 mils. I need a support system here and here to keep this in position so it doesn't sink down during the firing. And I'm going to use washers for that purpose. So here's the washers I'll be using. Some of them are actually 2 mil in thickness and other ones are thinner, and I'll have to double them up. So on my kiln board I'm going to lay these up with the points of the feathers facing the outside edge all the way around. And that's because I know my kiln, and I know that the outside edges of the kiln are a little bit cooler than the center. And I want the points of those feathers not to ball up and start pulling in. I want to try and keep them as intact as possible. So by directing them outwards like that, they'll be getting a little bit less of a firing than the quill end, which will be pointing inwards. Okay, now to cut down my mandrels now that they've dried overnight. I've got fairly heavy pliers here, and I'm going to cut them into thirds, so they'll be a little over an inch long each one. And the edges do chip off a little bit. That's expected. I only need the part in the center. There, so all I actually need is an area about as wide as this pen in the middle. So I'm going to stay about 3/4 of an inch away from the edge of the board there. Okay. And then I'll put the quill up in here with the eared side facing up. I can do all the fine adjustments later, but I'll get it into position for now. And then the clear cover piece. And then I can put my spacers on either side here to elevate the core. And I'll place the core in there. And move it into position. So like in my drawing, the clear cover piece bridges the joint below. The joints aren't lined up, they're staggered. Now there's options here that have to do with the visibility of my core. If I put a clear cover cap on top, then if I can't pick out all the shelf primer from my hole, then the shelf primer powder will be visible through the front of the jewelry. So I can put a black cap on there, which is typically what I do, but there's another option, and the other option is to dip the core in water and roll it in black powder so that it fuses into position and the black powder conceals any shelf primer that can't be removed from the hole. So I'll show the various options here in the production of these feathers. So I only need to put powder on one small area. So I'm going to arrange it in a long thin line. And I've wet the mandrel, I'm just going to dab it on here. I don't even need complete coverage. I just need enough coverage to face upwards so that the clear glass melts into the black glass and it hides the visibility of the core. There, and I'll just lay it on with tweezers because fat fingers seem even fatter when it's time to do this kind of stuff. Okay, now and only now can I measure and cut the clear cover piece that goes over top of the quill. The last thing on my drawing, this little cap right here that goes over top of the core. And here's a side view. There's the 2mm cover cap. Okay, that one's ready to go. And for the next one I can use one of the same washers in my support system. And this one I'm going to put the eared side facing down on the quill instead of up, because I'm going to put 3mm black on top of it instead of 3mm clear, and I'm going to put a black cover cap over the core. So this is an alternative to using clear cover caps and powder on the core, but I wanted to show that technique, the powder in the core. Okay, that one's done. So I'll carry on across the edge of the board. Yeah, it goes pretty quick. These are a bit fiddly, but they're expensive, so definitely worth the time. There's the feather pair. There's the cover piece. And there's the quill. It's going to be upside down with the irid coating facing down, because I'm going to make this one black as well. And a support washer. And a core. And then a piece of black 3mm glass on top of the quill. And a bit of adjustment here. And then a piece of 2mm black as a cover cap on top of the core. And a bit of adjustment. Okay, that one's done. So I've got all the ones arranged now that have the holes in them for hanging on a pendant cord, and the ones that are remaining are the ones that will be glued onto brooches and barrettes, so they won't be needing any core holes. There's the remaining ones, so they tend to be longer or wider than the ones for pendant cords. And yes, one of them broke. I think I'll be able to rescue that. So even though these don't have a core hole, they still need a cover cap to make sure that this joint fuses together nicely. Alright, this is all laid up. All my points are towards the cooler outside edges, and it's ready for the kiln. So I'm going to run this up around 600 an hour, and I'm going to start peaking in around 1400. What I'm looking for is, I want to make sure that my little caps on top of the joints are melted in nicely, but not completely flat. And I want to make sure that the bottom end of my quills is rounded, but not starting to pull into a ball. And most importantly, I want to make sure that my points on the feather tips don't start to round off too much and start pulling up into a ball. So I'll be peaking in starting around 1450. So I've run it up to 1500, and I've peeked in a couple of times, maybe every 10 minutes or so, and I consider it to be done. So let's have a little look. So my points haven't started to pull in yet because they're facing the outside of the kiln, and my quill ends are nicely rounded, but they're not balling up, and my cover caps over top of my cores are doing really nicely. They're not pulling in, they're staying nice and stable, about as wide as they were when they were cold glass, so it's looking good. Alright, it's done. So I'm going to crash cool it now. I'm going to drop the temperature down to around 1100 or so, maybe 1150, and then close the lid and let it cool slowly overnight. I'm crash cooling it because I want to prevent any further movement. If I just turn it off and leave it, there's a lot of heat in there and the glass will continue to melt. So I'm the controller here. I wouldn't trust this sensitive fusing to a predetermined time and temperature. So I'm describing a ramp rate for people that want to do programming, but I do prefer to be very involved in the process. It's necessary for most of the work that I do. Alright, let's have a look here. So first let's have a look at the thing that was the most concerning during firing, which was the little piece of glass I put on top of the cores. And you can see it's a beautiful continuous surface, and it didn't pull in very much at all, so I've got nice coverage here above my core. It turned out great. You sure can see the difference between a regular washer and a stainless steel washer. I wish I had more of those. And here's a look at the clear capped one that I put the black powder on the core. And you can see it's got incomplete coverage and some of the core is visible through the powder. And I realize now that what I did in my previous video, W-101, is I used enamels on the core, not glass powder. And of course the enamels are a much denser color. And here's an edge view, and you can see because I supported the core, it didn't sink down during the fusing, and it stayed in position. And my quill ends are nicely rounded and smooth, and my points are not overfired. They did not pull up into a ball, and they're still a little bit pointy, which is nice, because they were facing the outside of the kiln shelf towards the outside wall of the kiln. And here are the larger ones with no core hole for gluing onto jewelry. So here's an example of what I was trying to avoid by making the clear cover caps bigger than the dichro below. I was trying to avoid this. The incomplete capping of the edge of the dichro allows the coating to creep out and move up along the outside edge. And it's particularly important to do that with dichro that has a texture. You can see the individual lines of the texture right there, poking through the sidewall. But that side's much cleaner and nicer. So now, with the exception of the ones that I'm going to be using flat to glue onto a brooch pin, all of these are going to go through another firing to give them some kind of three-dimensional shaping. The barrettes will be curved to the same shape as the metal clip underneath them, and the pendant feathers will be just given a bit of a slight curl so they don't hang straight. Just a little bit of a curve to them. So I have this slumping mold, this ceramic bowl, and it's just got a slight curve to it. So that's what I'll use for shaping. Now for moving these over to the shaping mold, it's very important that I try not to disturb this core. This core needs to be in position during the slumping as well, or my hole could collapse a little bit. And I'll just carefully place it in the bowl like this, along one edge, just to give it a bit of contour. There, I think that's all I want to risk for this one. I don't want them sliding together and sticking during the slumping. And for the barrettes, I'm using these pieces of kiln brick that I sanded down to meet the curve of the barrette fixture. So I did a video on producing barrettes, video number W19, where I cover the making of these barrette slumping molds. So the quill end doesn't matter much, but the body of the feather has to be centered on the curve in order for it to be glued in position on the barrette. And I'll use some of these barrette slumpers for the pendant feathers as well. And these ones will curve them to the outside, whereas the bowl slump mold is curving them to the inside. And a long skinny one on an angle. Okay, I'm going to run these ones up around 400 an hour. They're a little bit thicker now, so I don't want to risk cracking them. And around 1100 I'm going to start peeking in, and I think they'll be nicely slumped around 1200. And as I've said before, I don't use programmable controllers, but I do describe a schedule. And the reason I don't use them is because I don't trust any of these processes to a predetermined time and temperature. I like to be involved in the process. I want to peek in and make a decision, to turn things off when I think they're ready. Alright, I'm at about 1200. Let's have a peek. Well, they're definitely starting to slump, but they're not quite done. I think I'll give it another 15 or 20 minutes at 1200. Alright, perfectly slumped. So I'll turn this off and let it cool down slowly overnight. Okay, let's have a look and get these finished off. Alright, now it's time to clean these up, so I'll start by picking out these cores. Nice curve. So I've got this little piece of copper house wire, and I'm just going to put some nicks in it with the pliers. Like that. And I'll use it as a bit of a file to rub out the core powder. So I'll just grab them with the pliers to give them a little twist and pull, and then get in here and clean out that hole with my little file. I prefer to do this dry. I don't like to get these wet if I can help it, but getting the shelf primer wet does help. I just like to try and do it dry first. Okay, there's a beautiful hole. Look at that. Wow. A hole through fused glass. And now let's see what this clear one does. See if I can get all that powder out of there. Well, I did manage to get all the powder out, and it looks pretty good. Now for gluing the flat ones, the ones that'll be brooches, I'm going to be using this E6000 glue. And I'm going to glue the brooch pins on an angle like this, not straight across, so that the feather hangs on a bit of an angle when it's pinned to a sweater or a coat. There, a nice healthy bead of glue. And now for the barrettes. I'm going to start by preparing them for gluing by cleaning the shelf primer off the underside. And the curve of the barrette meets the curve of the glass perfectly. And I'll glue on the clips and adjust them so that the clips, the corners of the clips, are hidden by the glass. Okay, I'm going to run some cord through these now, and then we'll have a look at how the different curve shapes look when they're strung up. Wow, these look amazing. So here's two pendants. This one's curved upwards in the middle, and that was one from the barrette mold. And this one here is curved inwards in the middle, so this is one from the bowl mold when I shaped them. Nice stuff, wow. And here's three of them together on the same cord with different shapes, so that sure would get a lot of attention wearing that. I put a couple of the smaller ones on silver snake chains. Nice stuff. Overall they turned out great. Well worth the extra care and attention, especially regarding these holes. And for the brooch, because of the angle of the pin clip, when it's attached to a sweater, then it will hang on an angle, but the pin clip will be straight across to even out the pressure on the fabric from the weight. Looks nice. And here's how the barrettes turned out. Nice stuff. I wound up using some of the darker areas of the Dichro sheet for them, so they're not too flashy compared to the necklaces. Okay, now for the number crunching. Once in a while I keep track of my time and material costs when I'm doing a project to make sure it's worth my while. And if it's a video project, then I share the results. So I'm making 21 of these feathers, and I'm going to sell them for $76 each, so that's $15.96. And I figure the Dichro and the barrette clips and that sort of thing probably cost $40. So I've kept track of my time here. It's an hour to cut the Dichro pieces and 20 minutes to sand them, and then half an hour to cut the clear cover pieces and the quill pieces and whatnot, another half an hour, and 5 minutes to prepare the cores, and an hour to lay it up on the kiln board. And I don't write down my fusing and slumping times, the kiln times, because when I'm in the shop watching the firings, I'm usually doing something else anyways. So there's the slumping layup, 5 minutes, and gluing the barrettes and that sort of thing, and picking the cores out of the pendants, 10 minutes. So 3 hours and 40 minutes, 3 hours and 40 minutes is 220 minutes. And the value of that time is $7 a minute, or $425 an hour. So there's actually a lot of value in making fused glass dichroic jewelry. Alright, nice stuff. Okay, so thanks for watching. And as I usually say, if you like what you see or learn something new, then please help to promote these videos to your glassmaking friends. At this point there's a little over 200 of these videos. I think it's 220, and there's still lots more to come, so stay tuned. And until next time, have fun taking advantage of the different textures in dichroic glass for making feather designs, and playing around with fusing holes into the glass.